Johnny, you've been very, very involved this week. You went all the way to European Parliament in Brussels and you delivered an address regarding what is going on in Israel right now. What is motivating your level of action on this?
Look, I mean, this is one of those moments in history that it's a time of choosing. You need to decide, and I believe, particularly as a Christian, that we have a responsibility that when we look back 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, when we look into the eyes of our grandchildren one day, that we can say at this moment in history, the single worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, a grotesque terrorist attack on an incomprehensible level, that we did something about it, and that hasn't always been the story of the Christian community, particularly with the Jewish community, and it's for me, it is one of those moments in history where you need to decide. We all need to decide, and I will be prepared to answer the question decades from now when my grandkids, when they ask, "What did you do when this happened?"
You know, and you've been very active on Twitter. I would encourage people to follow you there because, I'm sorry, X it's called now, where they can see all of your updates because you really are updating people on so many different elements surrounding this. But what do you make of, I mean, we have seen a number of these protests now on college campuses all over the world, but especially in the West, where you have people condemning Israel, going after Israel, in some cases saying absolutely horrific things about the Jewish people. What do you make of that movement, and why do you think there are so many people who seem to have the wrong idea about what is going on here?
I think a lot of times we look back at moments in history, like the Holocaust, for instance, and we ask ourselves, how could this happen? Right? How could human beings go to this level of depravity? And I think we're seeing in front of our eyes how this could happen. For instance, in Israel, some emergency rescue workers and some journalists reported that babies had their heads chopped off by the terrorist. And then we watched for a solid 36 hours while activists and some journalists were all arguing back and forth about whether the heads of the babies had been chopped off or not, or whether you could trust the reports from the people that were coming. By the way, heads of babies were chopped off by these terrorists. And they did a lot of other horrific things, and yet people chose not to believe it. It is like modern day Holocaust denial. And in the world we're living in, it's really, really hard sometimes to get the truth. And so I'm determined to help people know the truth, but not only to help them know the truth, but to have to confront the truth. So that's why I went to the EU. I went to Brussels. I spoke at an event in the EU Parliament. It was a historic day. The leader of the EU Parliament, the EU Commission, and the Council of Europe all gathered together on the plaza in the center of Brussels to pledge their support for the state of Israel against this horrific act of terror. But when it came my time to speak at a side event later on, while celebrating that incredible act of solidarity, I had one simple message, which is that words are not enough. We need action in a moment like this. And the terrorists are lying to a lot of people. You know, this is not just an evil act. Evil acts come with lies. And so they'll say things like the state of Israel is targeting civilians. The state of Israel is not targeting civilians. The state of Israel is doing everything they can to avoid civilians. They're sending text messages and videos and dropping paper flyers from the air. But the Hamas is ISIS. Okay, they did exactly what ISIS did. These ISIS-Hamas terrorists, sponsored by the Islamic Republic of Iran, are telling Gazans that the Israeli warnings are disinformation, and so they should ignore them so the Hamas terrorists can hold up the dead Palestinians and say Israel did this. And it's because Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinians. Hamas is a terrorist organization, and they should be called that. They should be called that by every elected leader, by every religious leader. And this is not, Billy, one of those moments where it's acceptable to talk about both sides. There's a good side and there's an evil side in this conflict, and we need to speak up for the Jewish community. And Israel deserves the right to defend itself.
Well, and I saw you actually posting about this, and I thought it's very disturbing, this idea that Hamas is using Palestinian people as human shields, essentially. I mean, that's what it sounds like when they're not allowing them to go south, and they're actually giving them misinformation to keep them there, knowing that there's a 24-hour notice that this incursion would essentially begin, right?
No, the Israelis are telling the Gazans exactly where to go to be safe. And Hamas doesn't want them to go there. But it should be no surprise. By the way, American taxpayer money and European taxpayer money paid for a lot of humanitarian assistance that went into the Gaza Strip. They're water pipes. In order to get water, there's a huge aquifer under the Gaza Strip. They have all the water that they need for the Gaza Strip. But what did Hamas do? Hamas dug up the pipes and they turned them into rockets to kill Jews. And by the way, not only did they slaughter elderly Jews and kidnap Holocaust survivors and kill other ones and do horrific things, incomprehensible things to women and children, burning people alive. Not only did they do all of these things to Israelis, they also did it to people from 30 other countries. Okay, this was targeting Jews, but not all of those Jews were Israelis or just Israelis. So there were Europeans of a dozen different countries. There were Americans and Cambodians and Thais and Filipinos and Canadians. It literally was a terrorist attack on the entire world. And this is a moment for moral clarity, and it should begin with religious leaders.
How much of this, and then I want to move to Iran, but how much of this is spiritual, right? Because we talk in terms of the temporal and the political, and we need to talk about it in that way because that's the reality in which we live. But yet it feels Israel's held to a standard that no one else is held to when these sorts of things happen. If somebody did this to America, what happened during 9/11? We immediately reacted, right? So how much of this do you think is spiritual in terms of the reaction that people are giving Israel when they're simply trying to respond and defend themselves?
Well, first of all, Billy, you mentioned 9/11. I think that's a good way to help Americans understand what happened here. This is like 10 9/11s or 12 9/11s. It's like 50,000 Americans killed in one city and another 20,000 taken hostage. So that's the scale. Except for it wasn't like an atom bomb went off. Hamas, like ISIS, went village to village, and then they went home to home to slaughter people. And in other acts like this in history targeting the Jews, even with the Nazis very often covered up some of their crimes. They hid a lot of what they did to the Jewish community. They didn't want people to know it. Hamas live streamed it. And I say all of that to answer your question. When you want to ask yourself what is satanic in the world that we're living in, there is nothing more satanic than what these Hamas terrorists did to these Jewish children and Jewish elderly and young people at a festival in the middle of the desert. This is the very image of Satan at work in our world, just like it was in the Holocaust, and in all kinds of other little ways with this irrational hatred of the Jewish people that isn't just showing up in the Middle East, it's also showing up all over the world. But by the way, you also see good in these moments. There was a Brazilian young woman who died in the terrorist attack, and they had just moved to Israel. And they were concerned about whether they would have 10 people at the funeral. It's a Jewish religious funeral, to have 10 people to have a minyan, to do a religious service. Over 10,000 people showed up at the funeral. There was a Muslim, an Arab Israeli Muslim paramedic, that when he found out what was going on, this Muslim Israeli, he drove his ambulance to the festival, and he was saving lives until the Hamas terrorists slaughtered him and stole his ambulance. And for all of this evil in the world, I think it's also important to remember those who are lost, but to honor the heroes that will emerge from this. And as Christians,
I would just want to say, in one example, you have people showing up knowing that this woman wasn't going to have people because she newly moved there to be at her funeral. And the other example, you have a Muslim man who is showing up and sacrificing his life to save others. That is powerful. And we haven't heard a lot of those stories. And I think it's important we talk about those stories when something like this happens, because we do, and we have to, focus on the negative and what's going on. And but I love that you brought that up, because that provides an encouragement in the midst of so much hatred and pain.
And and as Christians, I think every time the hate increases, Hamas called for a day of rage, explicitly called for the targeting of Jewish people all around the world. And already a Jewish teacher in France has been stabbed to death. A person that works at the Israeli embassy in China is in the hospital having been stabbed. Here's my call. Every single time you hear a word of hate from these terrorists against the Jewish community, my call is for the Christian community. I say it right now on behalf of the Congress of Christian Leaders. Every time those terrorists issue a call to kill, attack Jews, to spread hatred, we issue a call to pray for the Jewish community. We dedicate whole days of prayer and fasting for the Jewish community. And just like we did last Sunday, when so many religious Jews around the world weren't fully aware of everything that was going on because it happened on a Sabbath and across a Jewish holiday, the Christian community stepped up and filled the gap with our voices. And I think we ought to dedicate days at a time to pray for the Jewish community. Let's match their hate with our prayers and with our love.
Part of me wishes we could end there because that's so powerful, but I have to ask you about one more thing. And I love that call you just made because it's so important. It's so powerful. That's what we need to be doing. You did have a response online to the World Evangelical Alliance and the statement they put out. And I felt it was important that we talk about this. You had a very strongly worded response. They put out a statement on the crisis in the Holy Land, and they issued the statement they wanted to put out there. You did not think that was a sufficient or good statement. Can you tell us why?
Look, I don't like to criticize other Christians. I don't like to criticize anyone, to be honest. But when an organization like the World Evangelical Alliance chooses not to call Hamas terrorists and draws a moral equivalency between the state of Israel and these Hamas terrorists, as a Christian, the only thing I can do is call that out. And frankly, one of the reasons why I went to Brussels to speak at the European Parliament is because if the World Evangelical Alliance isn't going to do the job, then I will do it for them. And Christians all over the world ought to do it for them. Because this is a moment where it is very, very clear, a time that calls for moral clarity. And if you can't say that is a terrorist organization that committed an evil act, and Israel has every right to defend itself, then, by the way, it's not just that. 3 times in the last 18 months, the World Evangelical Alliance has been publicly involved with the Islamic State of Iran. They co-sponsored an event in Geneva on the role of religion in human rights with the World Evangelical Alliance. They issued a statement calling for the international community to relieve sanctions from the Islamic Republic of Iran and from Bashar al-Assad's Syria. And then on top of all of it, they issued a statement drawing a moral equivalency between the United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran. So my prayer for my brothers and sisters at the World Evangelical Alliance is that they change their course. But even if they don't change their course, there are 700 million evangelicals around the world. And I think we should make it very, very clear that we will land on the right side of history at this moment, and we will be able to answer the question. We'll look at our kids and our grandkids in the eyes. Where were you when this happened? What did you do when this happened? The worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust in a single day. And we will be able to say, we raised our voice, we spoke with moral clarity, we told the truth in the face of lies, we drew our line in the sand, and then, after this was all over, we did everything in our power to rebuild the world, to rebuild all these lives, and to realize a just and sustained peace in the Middle East. That's our mission at the Congress of Christian Leaders. It's the mission of all evangelicals that I know around the world.
Johnnie Moore, appreciate you taking us through this and that call to prayer. And thank you again for sharing those stories. We need to hear more of them. Appreciate you. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.